It's a crazy question, right? Is there enough fantasy? I mean, there's no quota for outlandish elements, no requirements for the impossible. Unless I missed something in the handy-dandy guide to fantasy, but it's all preference for ideas executed. There's no concrete bar, right? Yet, the speculative elements of stories will lack depth or fall flat. Fantastical concepts that feel like a filter over the mundane rather than true integrations. Especially for subgenres like high fantasy, where it's a feature that these stories take place on worlds fundamentally different from our own. So I ask the question again, is there enough fantasy in your fantasy? But while there is no clear guide, there are several patterns and concepts that will showcase themselves again and again, I've noticed, from just consuming and creating fiction, as places in the story where you can integrate the impossible or settle for something more mundane. There is room for that, by the way, the more mundane. I don't think anybody wants bizarre elements injected into every other sentence at the cost of good storytelling. There has to be balance, and I'll touch on that as we go, but I'm of the opinion that fantasy thrives when you skew it towards the more outlandish. Hot take, I know, but I want to explore how far. And it starts with world building. Obviously it starts with world building. It's the framework for the impossible, a sort of umbrella that every other concept has to acknowledge. World building isn't unique to fantasy though. You can world build a contemporary romance. But when it enters the realm of fantasy, again, the expectations of the genre is that there is a difference between the world we exist in and the one the story inhabits. You have to ask yourself why people are consuming these stories in the first place. Why is there a preference for some? Why do we pick up the book about the 9 saving the town from a dragon rather than the one about firefighters rescuing people from a wildfire when it could narratively be the exact same story? It's because of the unfamiliar, those weird, sometimes significant differences we wouldn't get otherwise, and as many as they can be, from the laws of nature and physics to flora and fauna history, whether there's an earthquake every 2 seconds, ash falls from the sky, or every adult gets spirited away and there is a barrier locking superpowered kids into a small town. Weird, significant differences. They can be plenty fantastical on their own, but these other concepts can act as a catalyst, pushing them towards more depth. And it starts with 2 questions. What are the big thematic ideas of the piece, and what are the different lenses those ideas can be viewed through? Themes come in all shapes and sizes, long run-on sentences about good and evil, as well as simple words like revenge or freedom. But the exploration of those ideas can also be done through the world, not just the characters or the storyline. And if you're saying, of course it can, stick with me, because there's this funny thing about storytelling and learning in general when it comes to understanding versus internalizing. From my experience, achieving the latter is never easy, and the only way I found is repetition and exposure therapy, which is essentially what this channel is for me actually. But Red Rising, a recent read I'm absolutely obsessed with, has one of my favorite examples of pushing themes. Classism is a very prevalent theme in this dystopian world, and people are separated into different colors, gold being the main ruling class. And it's not some surface level personality quiz type of separation, totally not throwing shit at any IP, but there's more to it than that. The main character is a red, and as you can probably already guess, that's the color that gets shafted the most, and there's this sequence I love where he is trying to become a gold so he can infiltrate the ranks and bring down the empire from within, fun archetype, but it's the illegal transformation process he has to undergo to become a gold. It's claimed several dozen people before him. He has to get surgery for chips implanted in his brain, increasing bone density 6-fold, muscle tensile strength, painstakingly doctored records, skin replacement, speech training, altered nerves. There is a fundamental and overwhelming difference between golds and the rest of humanity. It's why they rule. An artificial difference emphasized by this impossible body modification technology, by how far you have to go, how much you have to change to be considered the lowest version of them, before additional training after that. Mirroring the larger conflict of how the hell do we overthrow these guys? Embracing the outlandish to amplify the themes of classism. But anime also does this pretty well. It's a staple of the medium that it is over the top, and the fantastical concepts are no exception. It can get batshit crazy trying to explore its themes sometimes, as I'm sure you already know. It doesn't always have to go that crazy obviously, but it's an interesting study for what extremes look like. If you're looking for pointers though, aside from the obvious, Studio Trigger and Imaishi. They don't always, but when they get it right, they get it right. If you have a story, you have a theme. Dig a little deeper, it's always there. Question, what world building, what fantastical elements can I raise different viewpoints with? Remember, the goal is to dive below surface level. Is your theme on the value of life? What happens when you world build immortals? Hey, try to become a better version of yourself every day. How about a magic system that literally forces you to have a character arc if you want to level up? I could give examples all day. If you have any, feel free to shout them out. But another side note, it's not just themes, it's also symbolism, motifs, allegory, whatever literary device you want to grab and inject the fantastical into, you can. That's the fun part of the genre. There is a line in the sand though. Finding the right balance for you and the tone of your story is the result of sometimes heavy experimentation. For the umpteenth time, writing, crazy subjective. Just keep that in mind as you explore the heights you can take your fantasy to. But that brings me to some questions I have for you. How often do you see someone get punched through a building, chat face to face with a cosmic deity, shoot fire out of their fingertips? Never? Well, we must be living vastly different lives, but these things are very common in fantasy. Imagery you wouldn't otherwise think of. The simple experience of interacting with the impossible has the ability to create so much depth, and more than that, so much more perceived depth. The umbrella once again is world building. It's finding the elements of a story that can serve unique imagery or experiences. And from what I read of all these concepts, writers tend to execute on this one more than others. And of course, it's the most immediately enticing. I made sure to ask. A lot of people are immersed by things that can't be seen elsewhere except speculative fiction. Not just sights, but smells, sounds, emotions, experiences. A lot of experiences, action-packed, wonderstruck. It can go so far, and you don't necessarily have to come up with cool, never-before-seen, impossible imagery. I'm not saying add superfluous spectacle just to be flashy, but again, things are going to be unfamiliar in a fictional world you've created, and leaning into them visually is one of my favorite things to do. What does it look like when you just have a casual conversation with a deity? A visual I've seen portrayed many times and one I've played with. There is an infinite number of ways that interaction could happen, but none of them are ordinary, because it's an inherently outlandish situation. Prose writers lose the actual visuals, but we gain the advantage of being able to use vivid description, weaving words to trigger every human sense, giving little nudges to define the reader's imagination. What does it feel like talking to a deity? The weight of their presence, power thrumming through your veins as you shoot fire through your fingertips. And remember, indescribable in and of itself is a description, as Eldritch horrors tend to be. But what impossible thing you depict depends on the specific way your world differs. Maybe every single legend you've read of is actually real, like in the Dresden Files. It then derives its unique depiction of the impossible by how these myths interact with the real world, as is common with urban fantasy. It's the way Mortal Engines deals with moving cities, and the literal first line of the book involves London chasing a mining town over what used to be the North Sea. Things are different and immediately trying to entice you. Even less fantastical worlds like the Lies of Locke Lamora aren't excluded. A story set in a completely different world than ours, but it doesn't have insane fantastical elements dripping off of every paragraph. The story covers something much more grounded and con artists a little too cocky for their own good. It doesn't neglect those differences though, pushing chemistry just a little bit by splicing completely different fruits, and the result produces liquor as its natural juice, alchemical botany. Or giant elder glass towers left behind by a previous civilization, impervious to any form of damage and irreplicable. Dungeon masters are actually really good at this. Dungeons and Dragons thrives off of immersion. When everyone involved buys into the roleplay, that's when the collective storytelling works. And if you watch great DMs, they have this expert ability to paint a picture, tempting players to engage with these outlandish elements using description, regardless of whether there's already existing visuals like a board and miniatures. I could change this question to why do you like playing D&D, and I doubt the answers would change much. Pay attention to this next time you're watching or playing a campaign. Also, make sure to shout out your thoughts if you see a post like this from me. Might end up in a video sometimes, cause they tend to be an amalgamation of different ideas and things. But bottom line, where your world differs from reality is where you'll find these images and experiences to explore. And again, the whole point of this is adding depth, not just width. So it's not only how the world differs, but it also depends on what your story follows. That image of casually conversing with a deity hits a lot harder if it's surrounded by themes of faith. If the plot follows a paladin or cleric on their quest where they've tried to communicate with this deity before to no avail. I personally don't think that level of depth is necessary for every single piece of imagery you have, but if you do think it's lacking, this is a way. Weaving images and experiences that are a consequence of your world and story. I mentioned plot though, and the same principles apply. Same goes with conflict, it goes hand in hand with plot. And when it comes to deeper subgenres like high fantasy, where I mentioned it's more of a feature that the world is definitely not the earth we know, those differences are usually paramount to the plot. It's probably why a lot of high fantasy also tends to be epic in scale. But high fantasy or not, there are so many other places to take it. Again, embracing the impossible doesn't need to happen on a grand scale, and that applies to plot too. It can be the immortal journey of a being cursed through time so that everyone she meets forgets her when they look away. That plot is plenty fantastical without the epic. Also, great freaking book. But again, I want to emphasize that there is definitely room for the mundane, and that is especially so with characters. Speculative elements when it comes to characters are usually in the form of different races, or the character in question doing those impossible things with magic and the like. I've talked extensively about magic systems before, and if you're a fan of science fiction fantasy, I'm sure you're no stranger to how insanely hard made-up races can go. No, seriously, just balls to the wall at times. You've probably created a few. But where I think characters really get interesting is in something that isn't as fantastical. perspective. I'm yet to read a book that is just an objective overview on what's happening. That sounds like a listicle, not a story. No, it's usually filtered through the lens of a character, whether that's an actual character in the story, just a narrator, or a personified painting on the wall. Yo, imagine telling an epic fantasy from the perspective of an oil painting. But that lens, whatever it is, will undoubtedly shape the narrative, and by extension, everything else, including the more fantastical elements of the story. A common approach, especially with modern fantasy, is where the author will show this crazy different world, but then the perspective character is also from there, so they play it straight. The character is familiar with this place, this is their normal, and because their norm is so different from what you're used to, it amplifies the strangeness of it even more. Essentially the opposite of the unknowledgeable perspective character, which is also pretty common and self-explanatory. They don't know much about it, but when they're confronted with the impossible, their interaction with it, their response to those new outlandish situations can make for some very interesting moments, increasing that sense of wonder. Also, speaking of situations and circumstances, that's another aspect of characters, just where you put them. I've mostly already covered this, whether it's the cleric and the deity, or con artists trying to break into impenetrable elder glass towers. It changes depending on the disposition of the character experiencing it. And those varied viewpoints are great answers to the question of where can I ramp up that fantastical intensity for a much more fascinating narrative. Yeah, it steps into the realm of plot, themes, and the other concepts I've mentioned before, but none of them are standalone, they're all interconnected. No reader will ever experience the different parts of your world independently, unless they're reading your world bible or something, because when you fuse one of these concepts with the impossible, it usually leads you to avenues where you can integrate the others. By the way, notice how these catalysts are just the basic building blocks of a story, because the story comes first. The story always comes first. It's my golden rule, ignoring how extensive the world building gets, no matter how fantastic it gets, regardless of how much you integrate the impossible. If not, they're just disjointed ideas. Cool disjointed ideas, but disjointed all the same. Also, incredibly important side note I wanted to make clear, the ideation process is never this linear. It's messy, all over the place, no two people ever do it the same. And something else that's really important is how you deliver those ideas. Depth isn't all there is, and I dive into that juicy topic in this video. Okay, bye.